Welcome to Hearts of Scripture, where ancient words come alive, where every story of the Bible touches the heart and awakens the soul. This is the story told through the eyes of Dante Alighieri, the one who once walked through the depths of the soul and saw the light of heaven within the darkness of humanity. Today, I invite you to walk with me through that journey once more, not to hear another sermon, but to live again the pilgrimage of faith, of doubt, and of rebirth. I do not speak from memory, but from the witness of one who has walked, who has fallen, and who has been lifted up. Every word I speak is the ashes of doubt and the fire of grace. This is not only an ancient story. It is the story of every soul still wrestling between light and shadow, between the cry of the heart and the silence of God. Listen not only with your ears, but with your soul. I once knelt on the cold stone floor of an old chapel, where the dim light of the candles flickered like the breath of a soul, and I whispered, Lord, I give this to you. But when the dawn came, my heart was still as heavy as the night before. My prayer faded into the air, yet my worry clung to my bones like vines around a dying tree. I once believed that speaking was enough, that offering a word meant letting go. But I was wrong. The human soul does not open as easily as the doors of a temple. We give God what we dare not keep, but we keep what we dare not give. Some pray for their children, then stay awake all night, fearing they may lose their way. Some pray for healing, yet tremble again when the pain returns. Some say they have forgiven and yet replay the words that wounded them over and over in their minds. We do not lie to God, but sometimes our souls do not yet believe what our lips have prayed. I understand that because I have lived it. I have walked through the valley of fear, where every thought was a serpent coiled around my wrist, where every memory was a knock from the darkness. I know what it is like to read Scripture in the night and not hear His voice, to lay my burdens on the altar, yet carry them back as if the offering were never complete. We think prayer is surrender, but it is only expression. Prayer is words. The surrender is the movement of the soul. It is not a whisper, but a quiet storm within, where the will of man wrestles with the will of God. True surrender is not weakness. It is the strength of one who no longer needs to be the center. I have seen souls weary from trying to hold the universe in their hands, afraid that if they let go, everything would collapse. Yet it was only when their hands released that the world began to turn rightly again. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus also trembled. His sweat became blood. He did not pretend to be at peace. He truly suffered, yet still said, "Your will be done." That was the moment. Surrender became victory. I think the reason we still carry our burdens is because we have never truly believed that God can carry them. We say He's almighty, yet live as if He were powerless before our problems. And so our souls remain restless. I have learned that peace does not come when the prayer is answered, but when the heart stops demanding results, when I stopped clenching my fists, when I allowed my hands to be empty. I saw that grace had been there all along, waiting to be received. Surrender begins in tears, but ends in light. And in that moment, when I lifted my head from the cold stone floor, I knew my soul had truly been given away. Have you ever wondered why we can believe that God created the entire universe, yet struggle to believe that He can take care of a single day of our lives? I asked myself that question one long night when the lamp had gone out, but my heart was still awake. I have seen in many souls the same thing. Everyone says they believe, yet their faith trembles like a candle before the wind. There are those who do everything right, who read Scripture, pray, and serve. Yet deep inside they fear that if they stop trying, even for a moment, everything will fall apart. I call that the shadow of control, a shadow that seems holy but steals away peace. Do you recognize that shadow within yourself? Have you ever felt that if you do not do everything perfectly, if you do not pray enough, if you are not good enough, the grace of God will leave you? Share that feeling in the comments, because when you write it down, you are not only telling me, you are letting your own soul see what is holding it captive. I want to know where you are in this journey, so I will know that I am not speaking alone, that you are listening, and that these words have reached a heart somewhere out there. Because to me, the most precious thing is not numbers, but your presence, the presence of a real person searching for peace in a world full of noise. Thank you for being here. Truly. Thank you. I have seen many people disguise their fear with the language of faith. They speak of faithfulness, yet in their eyes is fear. They call their obsession devotion and their anxiety prayer. But you know, even within the church, there are souls more afraid than they are faithful. They believe they must do more, do right, do better in order to be loved. But the love of God cannot be earned through work. It is received through trust. And when faith is replaced by fear, the soul grows weary. I was once one of them. I tried to please God like a child, afraid of disappointing his father. I prayed more, served more, fasted, and tried to control every detail of my life, as if letting go, even for a moment, would make grace disappear. But in all of that, I did not find peace, only fear. Because when we strive to make everything perfect, we are unknowingly saying that grace is not enough. And that in itself is an insult to his mercy. God does not call us to be perfect. He calls us to return. He does not seek the performance of the soul. He seeks the honesty of the heart. Martha ran, busy, preparing, worrying, while Mary simply sat there, quietly at his feet. And Jesus said, only one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the better part, not because she did less, but because she trusted more. She sat in his presence instead of fearing the loss of his approval. Many times I think God still says that to us today. My child, you are too busy to hear me. You are so afraid that you cannot trust me. And I understand now that when fear wears the robe of faith, it looks righteous, but it is still bondage. So I want to ask you, is there something you are trying to control so tightly that you dare not give it to God? Is there a loved one, a future, a dream you cannot release, fearing that if you let go, you will lose everything? Write it down. Honestly, not to find an answer, but to see where your soul is holding on too tightly. Perhaps God is trying to open your hands, not to take away, but to give back. Control is an illusion. Surrender is freedom. When you learn this, you will realize that you no longer need to live as someone trying to make God love you, but as someone who lives because they already are loved. That is the difference between fear and peace. And perhaps only when your hands finally let go will you see that he has been holding you all along. One night, I sat in a small room where the candlelight trembled, casting my shadow upon the stone wall. And I thought of two women who once walked into Scripture as two opposing souls. Martha and Mary. Their story is not merely a moment in the house of Bethany, but a mirror reflecting the inner life of us all. One was so busy she lost her stillness on the other, so still she could hear the voice of God. I realized that within every person lives a Martha who runs and a Mary who waits. Martha acted out of love, yet fear crept into that love. She believed she had to do much to be accepted, to complete everything, to be worthy. And so, when she saw Mary sitting quietly at the feet of Jesus, her heart was stirred, not because Mary was wrong, but because Mary's peace exposed the storm within her. That is how the soul often reacts when it stands before someone who has found what we ourselves have lost. When Jesus looked at Martha and said, "You are anxious and troubled about many things, but only one thing is necessary. I believe he was not rebuking her. He was lifting the veil for her to see the truth, that her actions were born of fear rather than trust, just like me, just like you. We can do holy things with a weary soul. We can sing praise with a heavy heart. Service itself is not wrong, but when it becomes a disguise for anxiety, it loses the strength of faith. I once lived like Martha, believing that if I did not do it, no one would, that if I did not carry it, everything would collapse. But the more I tried, the farther I drifted from God, not because he left me, but because I no longer sat still long enough to hear him speak. There are times we think we are serving God, when in truth we are only trying to prove our own worth. It is a kind of pride hidden beneath devotion, a distorted belief that his love must be earned through work. When grace was never conditional, it took me years to understand that God does not need hands that are always busy. He needs a heart that knows how to be still. Mary understood this. She was not afraid of judgment or misunderstanding. She knew only one thing: the Lord is here. And she sat down, leaving all the noise behind her. In that stillness, she was not idle. She was transformed. For no one can truly hear the voice of God when the heart is full of the conversations of fear. Looking back, I see that I had lived like someone circling the altar, while the very one I served was sitting and waiting for me to stop. It is strange, but it took me a long time to understand that sometimes the first step toward God is not to move forward, but to stop. Stillness is not laziness. It is the humility of the soul. Martha offered her work, Mary offered her presence, and the Lord chose the latter. I ask myself, in this hurried life, how many times have I chosen to offer my work instead of myself? Perhaps that is why so many pray and yet never hear his voice. It is not that God is silent, but that the noise within is too loud. In the room of the soul, there are two chairs. One belongs to Martha, who stands every time something needs to be done. The other belongs to Mary, who sits and listens. Each day we choose one, and I have learned that when the soul grows too tired to serve, it is not failure. It is an invitation to return to his presence, because peace does not come from finishing everything, but from believing that he is still working even when we rest. In my journey, I have met people who spent their whole lives working for God, yet never met him, and others who did nothing but sit in silence, yet their very presence made the world remember him. When I understood this, I stopped trying to prove my faith through deeds and began to express it through trust. Service has value only when it flows from love. But if it flows from fear, it becomes a chain. And only when the soul dares to sit still do we finally see that God never asked us to be perfect. He only asked us to be present. Peace does not come from busy hands, but from a heart that rests in his grace. That night, I walked beneath a heavy sky, where the moon was hidden behind clouds thick as ashes. The silence was so deep I could hear my own heartbeat. I knew where I was, a familiar garden where fear and faith meet. Gethsemane. I was no longer the observer of the Saviour's story, but the one stepping into his own trial. Every soul comes here at least once in life, where prayer ceases to be theory and becomes a battlefield. I knelt upon the damp ground, the scent of earth mixing with the chill of night, and I heard within me the prayer that still echoes through eternity. Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Then came silence, thick and unmoving, as if heaven and earth both held their breath. I understood then this was not the plea of a weak man, but the sigh of a soul accepting what it cannot comprehend. I saw in Jesus the image of true humanity. He did not hide behind his divinity to escape pain. He allowed his heart to break completely. It was not surrender in defeat. But the struggle of faith itself, I too have prayed like that, through long nights without answers, through days when every door was closed. I have said, Lord, please change this. And when he did not, I wondered if he was listening. But as I sat in that garden, I understood some prayers are not answered with miracles, but with the strength to endure. True surrender does not come from the lips, but from the moment we stop arguing with God about how he should act. When I read those verses again, I did not see Jesus asking for escape. I saw him wrestling within himself. His sweat became blood, not because he feared death, but because he was torn between human will and divine will. In that moment, salvation did not begin on the cross, but in the garden, for only when the human will bows, grace begins to move. I remembered how often I tried to control outcomes, praying not to surrender, but to persuade God to change his plan. I thought that if I prayed long enough, if I was sincere enough, he would listen. But I was wrong. He did not need to be convinced. He needed me to trust. And faith is not believing that he will do what I want. It is believing that what he wills is good, even when it breaks me. When I understood that, I began to see Gethsemane not as a place of despair, but as the birthplace of redemption. Here, Jesus did not only accept the cross, he transformed it into victory. True surrender always happens in the darkness before the light appears. Every soul has a Gethsemane, a place where prayer gets trapped between desire and submission. Some pray for God to save a breaking marriage, but he remains silent. Some pray for a loved one to live, yet they still pass away. Some pray for storms of sickness, debt, or loneliness to end, but they continue. They think God is silent, but he's doing his quietest work, teaching them to believe even when they cannot see. I have been one of them, kneeling in my own garden with no moon, nor angels, only short breaths and trembling hands. Yet I have seen a miracle unfold, not around me, but within me. When I stopped speaking, the stillness of God entered like a gentle wind. It did not explain, it did not promise, it simply was, and that presence alone was enough to lift me up. When I walked out of the garden, I had no answers, but I had strength, and I knew this was what Jesus had experienced. When he left Gethsemane, nothing around him had changed, but everything within him had. That is the essence of surrender. Not changing the world around us, but changing the heart within us. I realized that surrender is not resignation, but trust that behind every pain lies divine meaning. Many think that submission means giving up, but it is the highest form of courage. Only those who believe in perfect love can place their lives into the hands of the one they cannot control. When my soul reached that place, I understood why Gethsemane is remembered forever. Not as a scene of sorrow, but as an invitation to those exhausted from holding on, that it is time to sit down in the garden and say, Lord, I do not understand, but I trust you, because in that very moment, when humanity stops struggling, God begins to act. And when I rose and left my own garden, I knew that what was to come might still hurt, but it would no longer frighten me, for grace had come not through a miracle, but through surrender. I once thought that surrender was a gentle act, a soft word spoken in moments of peace, but I was wrong. True surrender is not gentle. It is fierce, rough, and demands that the soul strip away every layer of disguise built by the self. I understood this one night when my soul was close to breaking. I knelt down and said that I was letting go, but my hands were still clenched tight. I prayed like someone trying to convince myself. Yet deep inside, I did not truly believe that if I stopped controlling, God would act. I believed only in my strength, in my reason, in the plan I thought was right. And so God let me fall. I did not fall because he punished me, but because he let me taste the bitterness of carrying a weight that was never mine to bear. It was in that moment I realized surrender is not words. It is a battle, a holy violence between fear and faith. I call it the sacred war, because to let go, we must face everything we try to hide. We must confront the fear of loss, the pride of control, the anger of unmet expectations. I wrestled within myself, torn between the desire to understand and the call to trust. I saw that no one truly surrenders in quiet peace. Surrender is the cry within the heart, the tear that falls when reason has no strength left, the act of throwing your burden off your shoulders like one in desperation. I remember the words of the Psalms, "Cast your burden upon the Lord, and he will sustain you." In the original language, the word does not mean to place gently, but to throw forcefully. I had thought surrender meant placing softly what I could not do, but it meant casting it away with all the strength left in me. I did that one night, praying without structure, crying out like a child. Lord, I do not want to hold this anymore. And in that moment, I felt something I had never felt in all my years of faith. True relief. Not because the problem disappeared, but because ownership shifted. I was no longer the keeper. When the soul truly surrenders, you feel an empty space at first. It is a frightening emptiness, as if you had just thrown away your only shield. But when silence follows, you realize there is an unseen hand holding you. It does not keep you from the battle. It gives you the strength to stand in it without falling. I once thought the strength of faith was to feel no fear. But now I know true strength is daring to fear and still letting go. Surrender is not giving up the fight. It is changing weapons. From striving to trusting. I have seen it in my own life and in others, that God never asks us to appear strong. He does not need believers who never tremble. He wants those who dare to tremble and still kneel. When I began to understand this, I learned what holy violence truly is. It is when the soul confronts its own will. I once resisted what God wanted, not because I hated him, but because I feared he would choose the path I did not want to walk. Then I discovered that what I feared most was often the path that led to freedom. True submission is the narrowest gate because it forces us to bow, to leave behind every reason, every demand, every condition. I remember the first time I truly threw my burden away. It was not beautiful. I cried. I said words that did not sound like a prayer. I accused God, asked him where he was, and then I fell silent. And in that silence, he felt stripped bare, with nothing left to prove, nothing left to hold. All that remained was breath and a fragile belief that he could hear me. In that moment, I understood that surrender does not begin with faith. It begins with despair. Only when we realize we cannot do we open the door to the one who can. And only when my hands finally released could God begin to act. I thought of the fishermen of old casting their nets. They did not know for sure if there would be fish. They simply threw with hope and experience. Faith is the same. You never know what will come. But you cast out what is in your hands and trust that the waters will not fail you. Surrender is that throw. Strong, decisive, without turning back. I have learned that if I keep holding on, I will do slowly in fear. But if I throw it away, I might get hurt, yet I will live. Because God never lets a truly surrendered soul fall into nothingness. He catches it. I no longer believe that faith is the calm of the mind. I believe it is the roar of the soul before the abyss. And though trembling, it still jumps. For when you leap, you discover that grace itself is the hand that catches you in midair. Surrender is the violence of faith, the boldest act a human can ever make. And once you have dared to throw it all away, you will see that in that very moment, you did not lose anything. You simply regained yourself. I once believed that the weight I carried came from the burdens upon my shoulders, until I discovered another prison, far more subtle and invisible. It was not what I carried in my hands, but what never stopped spinning in my mind. The questions that began with 2 words. What if? What if that had not happened? What if I had chosen differently? What if tomorrow is worse? What if God does not come in time? It was the prison of possibilities, a place where the soul is chained not by iron, but by imagination. I lived in that prison for a long time without knowing it. Every time I tried to surrender, fear would rise and whisper. But what if God does not act? I realized that no prison binds tighter than the fears disguised as devotion. People call it caution, discernment, spiritual wisdom. But often it is only fear dressed in holiness. I remember standing by a window one day, watching the rainfall, my heart as tangled as the wind outside. I had prayed for peace, but instead of peace, my mind filled with dark scenarios. I imagined failure, sickness, loss, loneliness. I was so afraid that even in calmness, I felt as if I were on the edge of losing everything. It was then I understood that fear needs no reason to exist. It only needs imagination. And imagination not guided by faith becomes a knife that turns back on the one who holds it. I once thought God wanted me to prepare for the worst. But in truth, He wanted me to trust that even if the worst came, He would still be good. There is a delicate difference that only an exhausted soul can perceive. Those who live in faith may still worry, but their worry does not last. Those who live in fear, even in peace, are never at rest. I ask myself, why do I believe in God yet live as if He might forget me? And the answer came like an echo in my heart. Because you still believe that love depends on results. Indeed, fear finds its place only when we believe our joy depends on something happening the way we want. But faith teaches us to believe that even if what we fear most happens, He is still God. That is the difference between anxiety and trust. I have seen people live in that prison their whole lives. They pray, but always with conditions. They say, I trust you, but I am afraid. They sleep while their minds wrestle with futures that do not yet exist. They are always ready for the worst. And so they never enjoy the good. And the worst part is, they believe that is faith. I was once like that. I thought I was being careful, but I was controlling. I thought I was believing, but I was bargaining. I thought I was preparing, but I was hiding. I turned what God gave as comfort into a never-ending negotiation. God does not ask me to predict the future. He asks me to stay in the present, where grace works. Yet fear always drags me back to regret the past and pushes me forward to fear the future. The soul cannot rest unless it lives in the present, for only in the present do we meet God. I learned this through tears. When all my plans collapsed at once, I feared the worst would happen. And then it did. Yet strangely, when it came, I was calm, because in reality, fear loses its power when it meets truth. When I faced it, I found God there, not with miracles, but with presence. He did not silence the storm. He taught me to walk through it without drowning. Since then, I have understood that true faith is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear lead. When fear leads, we build prisons in the mind, call them wisdom, and lock ourselves inside. I once thought if I prepared enough, I would be safe. But safety does not come from preparation. It comes from trust. No one can ever be prepared for the unpredictable but those who believe are strong enough to stand when it comes. I learned to replace the questions that begin with what if with two other words. Even if the storm comes, I will trust. Even if my prayers are unanswered, I will give thanks. Even if I do not understand, I will go on. Those two words open the prison door. Fear loses its power when the soul accepts every outcome. That is not surrender. It is freedom. I realized that true freedom is not having everything in hand, but not fearing to lose. I once thought peace meant the absence of problems, but now I know peace is when problems no longer control you. And that only happens when we stop asking what if and begin to say even if. When I changed the language of my mind, my soul changed shape. I began to sleep again, to smile though I saw no way out, to walk though the nights remained dark, because I understood that the only certain thing in this life is Him, and the only thing I must hold on to is His hand. Everything else is an illusion. The prison of what if collapsed, not because I was strong, but because I chose to trust. And when I stepped out of it, I saw that the world had not changed. Only there were seasons when I lived within the silence of God. A silence thick as night, pressing upon the soul, until every prayer I spoke returned to me like an echo in a deserted valley. I once believed that when He was silent, it meant He had left. That silence was proof of absence. But after years of walking through that darkness, I began to see that silence is not emptiness. It is another language of God, one that only a soul that has endured long enough can understand. I remember one harsh winter when I begged for an answer. Even the smallest sign, I wanted to hear, to know, to feel, but the heavens remained still. Day after day, I prayed, and there was no reply. In that silence, something terrible began to grow. Doubt. I asked if God was still there. I wondered if I had done something wrong, or if my prayers were too weak to pierce the dome of heaven. I tried everything to make Him speak. I served. I fasted. I read scripture. But the more I tried, the deeper the silence became, until one day I stopped, not because I lost faith, but because I had no strength left. I sat still in a cold room, the dim light of a candle flickering against a crucifix. I looked into His eyes closed in agony, and I saw something I had never seen before. He too had been in that silence. On the cross, when all the shouting faded, when heaven and earth seemed frozen in the moment of suffering, He cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? I suddenly understood, if the Son of God Himself could walk through the silence, then silence could not mean absence. It is the space of rebirth, because silence is where all the noise of reason must die so that faith can be born. I had spent most of my life trying to hear the voice of God, yet only when I could hear nothing did I begin to truly listen. In the silence, I started to notice small things, the slowing of my breath, the steady rhythm of my heart, and a quiet certainty that I was not alone. I could not hear, but I knew He was there, like a potter shaping clay in silence. He did not speak because He was forming me. I began to understand that when God is silent, it does not mean He has stopped working. In a hospital, the operating room is silent. No one speaks while healing is being done. I believe God works the same way. He does not explain every wound because He's busy healing it. I used to demand explanation, but I came to see that if God spoke too soon, I would never learn to trust Him when I did not understand. Silence is not punishment. It is the operating room of the soul. And the patient, have only one task: to stay still. I remember praying for light, but He gave me darkness, because only in darkness could I see how bright the smallest light truly is. I asked for clarity, but He gave me uncertainty. because only through it could I learn patience. I asked to hear his voice, but he gave me silence, because only in silence could I hear my own heart, buried beneath too many words. I have come to understand that true faith does not need sound, it needs presence. And God does not need to speak to prove he is here. He only needs to breathe. Sometimes his presence feels like the warmth that lingers after the fire. Unseen, yet still warming, I realize his silence was an invitation for me to stop seeking answers and start seeking him. When I stopped questioning, peace came, not because I understood, but because I accepted that not everything must be understood. I remember once sitting beside the bed of a dying friend. He held my hand and said, "God has not spoken to me, but I know he is here." I saw in his eyes the light I had long been missing. When he took his last breath, the room was filled with a strange stillness, not fearful but sacred. I knew then that was presence within silence. Since that day, whenever I walk through the dry seasons of faith, I no longer demand signs. I know that if I can still long for him, it means he is near, because longing cannot exist without the presence of the one it seeks. The silence of God is never empty. It is filled with work our eyes cannot see. And when the season of silence passes, we never return the same. The soul emerges deeper, quieter, more able to listen. I have come out of his silence, not with answers, but with faith, and that is all I need. Because now I understand the words of God teach us to know him, but his silence makes us belong to him. I once thought that surrender was the end, that when a person laid down their weapons, they lost control over their own life. But then I realized that in the kingdom of God, everything is reversed. There, surrender is not defeat. It is the beginning of real strength. When the soul bows down, heaven opens. When I stop holding on, I begin to be lifted up. I learned this not through theory, but through the breaking of my own heart. There were times I tried to hold everything in my grasp. My work, my relationships, my faith, even the calling I thought God had given me. I thought I was being faithful, but in truth, I was trying to control. I used the word responsibility to hide my fear. I said I was serving, but in reality, I was trying to prove that I was good enough so God would not forget me. Only when everything slipped from my hands did I realize those hands had never truly opened. And in that breaking, I discovered that surrender is not the end of the fight. It is the redirection of it. The battle does not happen outside, but within. I reread the story of the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus knelt in the night before his arrest. He did not fight soldiers. He fought his own will. If it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done. I once thought that was a gentle prayer. But when I looked closer, I saw the groaning of a soul being torn in two. That is the real battle, where humanity wrestles with divine will. And I understood every true surrender happens in the darkness of one's own Gethsemane, where only you, God, and fear remain. I too have had a Gethsemane, not in a garden, but in a small room where I knelt beside my bed, tears falling into my hands. I prayed for God to change what I could not accept. I said, I am willing to trust, but please do not take this from me. Yet silence answered me, and I knew he was not changing the circumstance. He was changing me. I realized that true surrender does not happen when you have no choice, but when you willingly lay down the sword because you recognize that the one before you is not your enemy, but your Father. Surrender is humility in its purest form. When the soul stops trying to understand, stops arguing, stops fearing, and simply says, I do not know, but I trust. And when I said that, a strange strength filled me, not the strength of a conqueror, but the peace of one who no longer needs to prove anything. I felt smaller, but freer than ever before, because in surrender, there is nothing left to lose. When you let go, you are no longer a slave to outcomes. You no longer live to make things go your way. You live to align yourself with His way, and in that divine order, you become unshakable. For what can defeat a soul that has already died to itself? I thought of Paul, who was beaten, imprisoned, and betrayed, yet said, I have learned the secret of being content in every situation, not because he was stronger than us, but because he had surrendered completely. The one who truly surrenders does not fear loss, does not need explanations, does not demand justice for himself, because he has placed justice in the hands of God. I have seen this in ordinary people. I have met the woman who lost her husband, yet prays for the man who caused the accident. The father who forgives the child who ran away. The friend who smiles in a hospital bed, surrounded by tubes and machines. They are not weak. They have surrendered. I realize surrender is not cowardice. It is the bravest act a human being can do, to let God be God. Because in truth, when we do not surrender, we are trying to play His role. We try to control outcomes, direct results, and collapse under the weight of that impossible role. I lived that way for too long. I carried the burden of trying to make the will of God happen, forgetting that His will does not need me to accomplish it. It only needs me to trust it. Surrender is when we stop trying to create miracles and start believing that the miracle has been there from the beginning. It is when we stop asking God to change others and start allowing Him to change us. I have come to see that surrender has two parts: death and resurrection. Death is when our will falls. Resurrection is when His rise is within us. And only through the death of self do we discover what it means to truly live. I once feared that surrender would make me lose myself. But now I know it was resistance that made me lose who I was. Surrender brought me back to my truest self. Quiet, trusting, whole. Since then, I no longer pray for God to do what I want, but for me to want what He does. I no longer ask why. I say, use me. I no longer chase spiritual feelings. I seek faithfulness in the ordinary days. I no longer fear losing control, because now I know that losing control in His hands is being held. And when my soul truly surrendered, I felt a peace, not of this world, a luminous silence, as if the whole universe had exhaled. It was not the end, but the beginning of freedom, because surrender does not make you weaker. It makes you invisible to fear. And when fear can no longer see you, it loses its power over you. In that moment, I understood what I had searched for all my life through reason was hidden in one simple prayer. Lord, I surrender. And in doing so, I live. I once thought that to be healed, I had to be strong, to know how to stand up, to learn to hold back my tears and appear steady before others. But the longer I lived, the more I realized that no one is ever truly healed through false strength. The soul is healed only when it dares to break. I have seen so many people come to church with calm faces, hands lifted in worship, mouths singing about victory, but their eyes were empty. They were hiding a pain that had never been allowed to speak. They thought God only welcomed beautiful words of praise, not knowing that He also loves the cries that rise from the depths. I was once like them. I believed that crying was weakness, that to admit weariness was to insult faith. So I stayed silent, swallowed my tears, tried to become a model of belief, but my soul was rotting from the inside. One night, I could no longer bear it. I sat on the floor in the dark, and for the first time in my life, I did not pray with rehearsed words. I only said, I am hurting. Lord. And then I cried without stopping, without needing to look composed, without needing to prove that I understood his plan. I just cried. And in that moment, when my tears touched the ground, I felt the presence of God so near that loneliness disappeared. I realized that God does not need well-written prayers. He needs truth, and truth often speaks through tears. From then on, I learned to let my soul weep. I found strength in my weakness. I discovered that God is not afraid of human tears. He has wept before. When he stood before the tomb of Lazarus, he knew that within minutes he would raise the dead. Yet he still wept. He did not weep out of despair, but out of love. And if the creator of the universe could cry, then why should I not be allowed to? Since that day, I no longer fear breaking down. I began to understand that the tears we shed before God do not make us weaker. They make us real, real before ourselves and real before him. Once I sat beside an old woman during prayer. She said nothing, just held her rosary in her hands as tears fell quietly onto her knees. I asked her, "What are you praying for?" She said, "I do not know what to say anymore. I just bring my tears to God." That sentence has stayed with me ever since. I realized that sometimes the deepest prayers are the ones without words. God does not measure our faith by fluency, but by honesty. From that day forward, I began to live differently. I no longer hid my pain before him. I brought my wounds, my doubts, my anger. I said, honestly, I do not understand what you are doing. And strangely, I felt more at peace than ever. Not because I was given answers, but because I no longer had to pretend. I realized that what keeps us from healing is not pain, but the pretense that we are not in pain. When we hide our wounds, we keep God's hand from touching them. But when we dare to open them, even when they bleed, he begins his work. Healing does not come from forgetting, but from facing like a physical wound. If left uncleaned, it will fester. The wounds of the soul are the same. They heal only when brought to the light. And that light is grace. I remember the first days after my mother passed away, I went to church and heard songs about hope. But inside I felt empty. I could not feel anything but the cold. I wanted to believe she was in a better place. But my heart only wanted one thing, to hear her voice one more time. I told that to God, not as a ritual, but as a sigh. And in that pain, I felt him there, not to give me reasons, but to share the sorrow. I began to understand that God does not heal by erasing pain, but by entering it with us. He does not put out the fire. He stands in it with us. That presence is the miracle. And from that moment on, I stopped seeking healing as the absence of pain and began to see it as a deeper communion with him. Every tear I shed became a prayer. Every wound became a place for grace to enter. I understood that God does not ask us to come before him looking strong. He wants us to come with empty hands and weak hearts, because only when we are weak does he have space to be strong. Weakness is no longer the enemy of faith. It is the doorway to surrender. And as I sat in stillness after a long cry, I realized something profound. Tears are the language of the soul when the mouth has no words. And in that language, God always understands. I do not need to teach him how to heal me. I only need to let him be there. And that is when the miracle begins, not the loud miracle of great things, but the quiet one, a lighter breath, a calmer night, a slow return of trust. I realize that sometimes healing is not becoming who I was before, but becoming someone new, someone who has learned that pain does not destroy faith. It makes it real. And in the dim light of weakness, I saw that God was not standing far away. He was kneeling beside me, silent, yet present And I knew I had been healed not because I stopped crying, but because I no longer cried alone. I have walked through nights that seemed endless, when the light of faith was nothing more than a faint glimmer flickering in the darkness of trial. But now, as I look back on the road I have travelled, I understand that all those seasons of breaking were never meant to destroy me, but to remake me. Every time I let go, thinking I was losing everything, I was actually being set free. Every time I cried and thought myself weak, my soul was being cleansed of false pride, all the things I once feared silence, loss, loneliness. Waiting became classrooms of grace, where God taught me the strength of stillness, the power of faith without evidence, and the beauty of peace that does not depend on circumstance. I have learned that true freedom does not come when I control everything, but when I no longer need to. I once thought faith was a flame that must always burn bright, but now I know there are days when it is only a small ember, just warm enough to keep me alive through the night. And God does not despise that ember. He breathes on it gently, keeping it alive until it burns again. I have learned that God does not ask for perfection, only presence. I have not always been full of faith, but He has never left me. When I walked through the wasteland of doubt, He walked with me. When I could no longer pray, He still listened to my sighs. When I had no more words for gratitude, He did not rebuke me. I have come to see that my relationship with Him is not measured by passion, but by truth. And the truth is, I am weak, inconsistent, often trembling between belief and fear. Yet in that honesty, He draws closer than ever. I have seen Him not in grand miracles, but in the quiet details of everyday life. A morning when I woke and felt my heart lighter, a breeze that carried the scent of hope, a familiar voice reminding me that I am still loved. God comes in simplicity, but touches the deepest parts. I no longer ask Him to change the world around me. I ask Him to keep my heart soft, for only a soft heart can see grace in what is imperfect. Now, when I speak of faith, I do not speak in the language of reason, but of experience. As one who has walked through the valley, I know surrender is no longer a single act. It is a way of living. Each day I must choose to believe again. Morning I say, Lord, today I still place this in your hand. And each night I must learn to let go of what I still do not understand. True faith is not never doubting, but returning after every doubt. The mature in faith are not those who know all the answers, but those who have learned how to stay silent when there are none. And I, who once feared silence most, I am now grateful for it. For in silence, I have realized that the voice of God does not thunder. It seeps gently into the soul as peace. I used to beg God to show me the path to walk, but now I only ask Him to walk with me, however winding the road may be. I no longer pray to be spared from the storm. I pray to stand firm within it, because His presence matters more than the escape. And now, as I look back, I see that everything I once begged God to spare me from became the very thing He used to draw me closer to Him. All those sorrows, however cruel, carried a hidden blessing within them. I have learned that true peace is not the reward of patience, but the fruit of a self that has died to its own will. That person no longer needs control, no longer needs reasons. Only God. I have lived through seasons of drought, and now when I see even a drop of grace fall, I know it is not by chance. It is proof that He is still watering the seed within me, even when I thought it had died. I look around at a world straining to be strong, trying to build happiness from fragile things, and I smile quietly because I know that true strength is found in weakness, true freedom in surrender, and true victory when we stop trying to win and no longer need to understand everything to believe. Because I have seen enough of God in what I could not understand. I am grateful for the losses because they made room for real faith. I am grateful for the dark nights because they taught me to cherish the light. And I am grateful for myself because I did not give up along the way. Now I live as one freed from the prison of fear. I still work, still love, still fail. But I no longer strive to prove myself. I let things unfold in the hands of God. Not because I am passive, but because I have come to trust that His hands are steadier than any plan of mine. I no longer look for miracles outside. Because I have found the miracle in my own peace. Peace does not come when life is stable. But when I accept that even in chaos, I am safe in Him, and when my soul finally grows still, I hear what I could never hear before. A whisper, soft as breath, yet strong enough to bring me to tears. You're never alone. I have been here all along. And in that moment, I know the journey has not ended in triumph, but in rest, in the arms of the one I have trusted all my life. Now that the journey has come to an end, I stand between silence and light, looking back at the long road my soul has walked, from the trembling days of doubt to the quiet surrender of faith. I have come to see that every pain had its purpose. Everything that once brought me to my knees became the place where God taught me how to rise. Not by my own strength, but by His. I have learned that surrender does not make me smaller. It makes me real. Faith is not the shout in a crowded church, but the steady breath in the unseen night. Peace does not come from perfect order, but from no longer needing to know the outcome. I have lived long enough to understand that the most precious thing is not the answer to every question, but the quiet presence of God in moments that once felt like His silence, because it is in silence that He reshapes the soul. And some wounds have not disappeared, but they no longer hold me captive. They have become bright scars, places where grace is engraved, proof that His love is stronger than any loss. I no longer ask for calmer seas. I only ask that my heart not fear the waves. I no longer need to know what tomorrow holds. I only need to know that He will be there. And that is enough for me to keep walking gently, firmly, and free. I write these words not as one who has understood everything, but as one who has learned to stop needing to. I share this journey because I know someone somewhere is standing where I once stood, breathing through fear, praying in the long night without an answer. If that is you, please do not think you have been abandoned. Silence does not mean absence. Perhaps God is working deeply within you, in a place only He and your soul can see. Keep believing, not because you are strong, but because He is faithful. Let every unknown become an invitation to draw closer to Him. Let your tears not be proof of defeat, but seeds of transformation. I pray that whoever reads these words will pause for a moment, take a deep breath, and let your heart rest. Life does not need to be explained. It only needs to be surrendered. We do not need to prove to God that we are worthy, because it was when we were weakest that He chose us. Believe that with all your heart and live each day as if you are already redeemed. For in truth, you are, if there is one thing I have learned from it all, it is this: faith is not the fire that burns away fear, but the small lamp that helps you walk even while fear remains. And perhaps everything God ever wanted to teach us can be found in one simple sentence. Do not be afraid. I am here. So when you turn off this screen, hold on to this one truth: that peace is not the reward waiting at the end of the road, but the companion walking beside you all the way. If anything I have said has reached a quiet place within you, let it live there. Slow down, listen deeper, love more sincerely. Choose forgiveness over anger. Choose trust over fear. And choose to keep walking, even when you cannot see the path ahead. That is how we walk with Him. And when you do, the world around you will change not loudly but truly. I am grateful that you are here, that you have listened, that you have walked with me through this journey of the heart. No one comes to these words by accident, for no one arrives at the word of God without being led by him. Thank you, because your presence is proof that grace is still at work in this noisy world. May peace fill your heart, and may the word of God you have heard today walk beside you in every step ahead. I pray that you find light in silence, strength in faith, and rest in his presence. May your home be full of peace, your heart full of courage, and your soul full of quiet trust that you are never alone. When you close this video, remember one thing: God is always beside you, in every moment, in every breath, until we meet again. And stay strong, stay gentle, and stay near his grace